Great. So welcome everybody. We want to make most of this time today to be an opportunity to chat and hear what you're interested in. So we're not planning to talk at you for anywhere near the full time. Just give enough context and background though, so that we can have a great conversation together. So yeah, the title for today's presentation is Building the Evidence Base on ICTforAg. And we're going to be sharing some of the findings from an ex-post study that we did of a program called Naatal Mbay. So just very quick overview. I work for Market Share Associates. Our mission is bringing actionable insights to economic development using systems approaches. And so very much the study that we're going to talk about today is one that is grounded in really a systems approach to understanding change over time. And let me turn it over to Jean-Michel, my co-conspirator here, to give a quick introduction.
Okay, and my mic is on. Okay. So, hello everyone. So I'm Jean-Michel. Shortly, I used to be the chief of party of the program we're going to be talking about. So I'm here to give you some from the ground news from the ground or historical background of for the discussion that we're going to have. Right now, I'm working as a consultant to the International Finance Corporation in their agribusiness team. And so, I've worked in the sector for some time, and I'm really looking forward to interact with you on this really interesting project that actually, was completed in 2019 and has kept going. And so that's the whole story. And we will see what the role of ICT was in getting that success going beyond the project's end.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm Ben Fowler, normally based in Denver, but today here in Toronto. I am a co-founder and CEO at Market Share Associates. And I'm in the context of today, I lead the M&E and CLA learning stream for the Market Systems and Partnerships program that we will be introducing, or I'll be talking about briefly in a second. But it's nice, Jean-Michel and I actually first probably started talking maybe just slightly under 10 years ago, when he was in the thick of it in Senegal and working directly hands-on with many of these issues. And so we had the opportunity many years ago to start looking at some of the work he was doing while it was in progress. And so it's so nice now to have had the opportunity to look back many years afterwards and see how it evolved over time. So with that, just really brief overview, the Market Systems and Partnerships activity is USAID funded. It's a 6-year-long activity that has both a component that it funds private sector companies to engage in different innovative activities, but it also generates learning. And it's that second part that we are going to be focusing on today, particularly with a focus on market systems development and private sector engagement. So it wants to advance learning and good practice around those two areas. And it does so by means of generating new evidence, capacity tools, technical assistance, and services. All with the aim to ultimately enhance inclusive and resilient agriculture-led economic growth. And so this very much, what we're talking about today is part of the evidence generation aspect of MSCP's purpose. So one of the things that we recognized early on in the development of MSP is that there is relatively less evidence available than we would like around how programs that are using a market systems development or an approach based on facilitation that really seek to work via market actors and create long-term sustainable results, how those programs tend to fare following program closure. And one of the reasons is that so much funding tends to be done in terms of evaluating immediately at the end of a program, but not afterwards, not giving it enough time to see, well, once the program closed up and the funding stopped, what actually stays and what ends up closing or ending. And so MSP has agreed to fund at least 3 ex post studies with the aim of doing as many as 6 of programs that have taken that type of approach and understanding the results that they've had at least 3 years following the closure of the program. So this is the very first one that we've finalized and completed the study of. For each study, these are the 4 types of questions that we've had. Is understanding essentially in terms of the systemic changes that were aimed for at the beginning of the program, and we're seen to have happened by the closure of the program. What does that look like at least 3 years on? How have those evolved? How have they created impacts for the target populations of focus? And what can we learn from market systems development in the meantime? So the graphic on the left really shows the 4 focus functions of interest to ourselves in this study. We looked at the aggregation function. So in other words, how is crop, primarily rice, aggregated within northern Senegal, and how has the way that function operates changed over time, as well as access to agricultural finance, crop setting, standard setting and enforcement, and commodity information collection, sharing, and learning. And it's that 4th focus function that we're going to be primarily focusing on today as it relates to ICT4Ag. This is kind of the typology for MSD, the understanding being that you should see results be more sustainable and last longer following program closure, even if it takes longer to get started, because you're working via other market actors, so you're not giving things directly to your target populations of focus. In early years, you're not going to see quite the same results so quickly, but ultimately what you do end up seeing is going to ultimately be larger and certainly more sustainable than a more direct delivery approach. So that's it from me for the moment. Let me turn it over to Jean-Michel.
Thank you. Now, for the sake of time, we're not going to go into the details of what was Naatal Mbay. Here I just put this, this kind of gearbox, that kind of gear system there, just to show you what Naatal Mbay had to address. It was, what's interesting to note is that Naatal Mbay started pretty much when USAID decided to embrace the market systems approach. Before that, we would talk about food security programs, but more in the strict value chain approach. Value chain approach meaning that you recognize that there were different stages, different elements, different functions that contributed to the actual product's profitability, and you have them there, and they actually form a certain integration, and in the middle you have a whole series of actors that interact to make to turn the rice seed into rice bags that eventually reaches the population. Now, at the time, I mean, because it was the shift towards market systems, today, the conceptual framework that we have today was not there yet. I mean, if you go to the ample literature that actually USAID has produced, it's really a big body of knowledge now that was simply not available at the time. And so we were taking this value chain approach and thinking, because we were asked under Naatal Mbay, it was one of those first projects where we were tasked to scale up and scale up inclusively. Now, the only way to scale up inclusively is by going systemic. But we didn't really have all those toolkits that are now available. And really, I encourage you to go and check them out. And actually, that was kind of Ben's job. He was very involved in that. And taking this learning and turning it into tools. Today, I mean, a market system specialist is actually a thing, and it's really worth looking at. So just to tell you that of all these things that were done, in a previous project, and we had successes in all these little domains in extension, tracking, field logistics, seeds, inputs, a lot developing brands. But like all projects, the question was, is it scaling? And of course it wasn't. I mean, there was like some interesting aspects, but clearly the system, we didn't have a full focus on the systems themselves. If you can just go back a little bit, Ben, the one thing we found, and intuitively, is we found that beyond the value chain domains, it was important to achieve scale to have a connection to the financial domain. And for the financial domains to work, the key element was information. And so digital systems, in the end, even though it wasn't in the initial plan, ended up being a critical cross-cutting component. And so that was a big element, a big innovation of Naatal Mbay, to have put digital information at the heart of the value chain system. Okay.
Great.
So what was rice in Senegal? Here, I mean, the project covered much more than the Senegal River Valley, but the reason we're talking about it today is because the north of Senegal really presented all the potential to really make it to the mainstream market, commercialization, and really allowed to really test all the dimensions of a full market system, a full commercial market system, with high yields, very important part of the farmer output being marketed, and focus and a possibility of making 2 seasons and connecting to Dakar. And there was a possibility to really scale, but also establish commercially viable systems. And the South was different. It's more a resilience dimension. Many successes were achieved in the South and are still maintained, but it is still not as advanced as what has occurred in the Valley, and actually inspired a lot of other value chains to this day. And so let's go to the next one. So when we picked it up, PCE was a predecessor project, and what we picked up at that time, what you see here is a map of all those micro mills that were in the valley. They were milling rice and, developing livelihoods that didn't go much further than their immediate, radius of influence, which was, 10, 20 kilometers. There was a bit of aggregation. Everyone ran their own show, like a little mom and pop shop. There was maybe 2 or 3 mills that were trying to develop a commercial activity, but it was just not picking up. And this had actually developed with a recently implemented mill a financing program that worked well and was promising. You have to understand that at the beginning of Feed the Future and the involvement of USAID in the area, it was really a very disjointed and kind of survival operation, and it was certainly not going to make a dent in the today, let's say 500,000, 600,000 tons at the time that were imported into Senegal from Asia. And that was the whole point. Are we able to do that? To make a dent in those imports? And for that, it was a need to make a radical change in the way that rice was being produced and marketed, but not just produced and marketed. Produced was financed, produced, tracked, and marketed. And so that's where the dimensions of finance and digital were so important to turn it into a supply chain that could connect with urban markets. Okay. So here we're picking up again the summary of the initial situation and the support of Naatal Mbay. So you see this notion of informal marketing. This is classic of market system analysis. Like just what I told you initially is being translated in the, let's say, understanding that we have today when we analyze a market. So all these are usually actually pretty standard and correspond to a lot of countries. Largely informal marketing, fluctuations in price, limited capacity amongst producers to network, et cetera, limited trust, large, small scale, informal rice processing that doesn't grow. And so, well, Naatal Mbay's support essentially focused on managerial capacity of the networks and the processors themselves, their ability to enter commercial relationships and introducing simple contracts. Also, there was a whole, set of activities to orchestrate all that. Now, that is kind of standard market systems work. Where Naatal Mbay innovated at the time was that this is all nice, but we recognize that without a strong information flow and a set of evidence shared by all the actors and a capacity to produce it and manage it and analyze it, all of that was just, going to be trainings and all that, but it wouldn't have the ability to turn into an actual system. And so that's why, if we go to the next slide, so that's why we came up with the idea of developing digital tools that would support that would support the shift. And it's not just introducing digital for digital's sake or because it's giving access to something. No, it was really as a decision support tool, a shared tool by all the actors that enable dialogue, negotiation, information exchange to get the transactions to work. It was like this notion of like transactional support, this idea of integration. It's not just a digital tool that allows you, I'll order a bag of maize seed, like I'm ordering something from Amazon. It's not that kind of digital. It's more digital so that a farmer organization has enough information so that they're able to negotiate and discuss delivery programs with a partner, and that partner has the digital capacity to forecast and structure his teams to go and harvest. And then that information could be shared with the banks to prepare loans, organize seed supplies, and have it circulate. And so those required, the series simply of creation of shareable data. And how do you do that? And so we came up with a completely centralized approach to it. And that was a big innovation to say, okay, we're not going to produce the standard all-encompassing app that's going to do everything for everyone. We said, no, everyone should have access to their data, and we're going to develop sharing practices by email, WhatsApp, whatever. I mean, but the important is that people have information to share. They know what to do. And that's why that little picture is great, is because that's, and so, that was, one of those young people that, were trained to use Excel sheets to track, rice inventories and things like that. And right now, I took a picture on the fly. She was asked by a field visit, what was the proportion of X varieties of rice? And she said, okay, I'll just put a pivot table together and tell you which ones they are. And she did that, and she just showed it to the World Bank people who were pretty impressed. But in any case, globally, the technologies were Excel-based data consolidation and analytical tool that did a lot of stuff and track membership, field performance, etc. At one point, we brought in cloud-based data collection software packages. We had people do GPS-enabled land surveying. There was some tracking software that was developed locally by local programmers. There was an SMS system put together to do rainfall tracking in southern zones. All of that was developed in an ad hoc fashion, but to support the activity of the farmer and the value chain actors. And what we did do, though, as a chief of party, I needed monitoring and evaluation information. So I just, slipped in and said, if you can give me gender disaggregated data, I'd be really happy. And by the way, you have a contract with me, so you're going to do that. And so for me, it really turned the entire program into a great M&E system, and we had great data. Now, we'll talk about that later, what happened with those additionals that we brought in there, what happened after the project with that, that was an element that was a little add-in that, influenced the design of the various applications. We'll see they made it the really sort of when actually they had to meet reality, after the project. Let's go. It's the next one again. Let's see. Okay, so that's about it. I mean, like we said, the whole notion here was not to get an app across, was more to develop the ability to self-manage digital data. We found that small co-ops could actually do that. They didn't have to be passive, but we had to keep it simple and focused. So they were tailored to the management needs, but also aligned to their technical context, their capacity and skills. We also found, and I like to say that, and I've seen it in many countries, there is a geek or two in every village. Okay, so you will always find someone that is good with numbers, and if you put them a laptop in their hands and you show them how Excel works, it doesn't take long. You have a specialist. And so, and the technologies were varied, simple Excel softwares, enabled to share data, climate information. They could manage the monitoring of agronomic plots. They could, they even structured Excel tables for uploads by the insurance company so they could insure, let's say, 3,000 farmers in one upload. The upload was prepared with a simple table, Excel spreadsheet, but it really accelerated that and enabled us to scale up, for example, the adoption of crop insurance in certain sectors. Not in the Senegal River Valley. Senegal River Valley was more linked for loan applications. So, it really accelerated the process and the adoption, but also the efficacy of the value chain, and actually made it much more profitable and transparent. Okay, so the results, and I forgot if that's my slide or yours, but
Go for it. You can do this one, and then I'll take the next one.
okay, so well, Naatal Mbay actually had was very, very successful in terms of scaling. Just so you understand, in its zone of influence, it ended up touching at least 40% of the households that were in that area who ended up having increased, and in the Senegal River Valley, it was even more. It was something like 70% of the farmers involved, and who actually witnessed serious increases in prices. There was a stabilization in prices. There used to be a standard price dip at the beginning of a season. That disappeared because of the transparency in management and the contract farming. Annual lending was in the $20 million, $25 million a year in the valley. And the reimbursement rates were very, very high, and which actually enabled the system to grow and actually have a macroeconomic impact on inputs. And so that's what we're talking about here, and all that with a level of transparency and negotiation and understanding of the market flows by the actors who before that were just in a situation of total distrust and constant default. They turned into a system of very accelerated trading, and it was very successful. And so, well, I was at the time, I could say, when the Finite project ends, well, mission accomplished. But as I write in that slide here, there were concerns, what is going to happen once we leave, and because we always were a little bit present and you saw how things work, and we thought, what's going to happen? And that was 2019. So you can imagine that right after that, COVID came in, and then after COVID, well, with Ukraine, and then the climate shocks in there. So from 2019 to 2023, if that system had to die, it was going to die. And there was actually a presidential election in there. And in Senegal, it's a tradition that when there's a presidential election, all the rice farmers default, and then they ask the president to cover their unpaid loans. And I remember calling up a rice leader. I said, so there's the election. So are you guys going to default? And he said, no, we have no time for that. We actually have to farm rice. And if we default, we just can't get our loans and we won't be farming, which is idiotic. And I said, oh, that's an interesting development. I think Ben did not talk about that in his report, but that's the kind of anecdotal evidence that came out and gives me hope that let's see what Ben has to say, because he's the one who's going to tell me if the thing ended up working in the end. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you. That's
Do
great.
we stop here? And if people want to ask questions on
That's
Naatal
right.
Mbay, like a few minutes, if you want a little bit more details to understand the context, maybe I wasn't clear enough.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's pause a bit before we talk about anything that we found, just making sure that everyone's on the same page with what this model really looked like, what the different tools were that have been introduced, all of that. Does anyone have a question? And feel free to come off of mute and share it verbally, or if you want to write it in the chat, either one of those is fine.
Okay.
No questions?
All good. Let's go.
All good. All right. Then we'll keep going. Perfect. And if you have more, of course, we've got more time at the end. So as I mentioned at the start, this was a great opportunity then that we were able to go back. There had been a final evaluation of the program, but we were able to go back about 3.5 years after the close. So that meant earlier this year in about February, we were in Senegal. And so we undertook more than 100 informal interviews and focus group discussions. Ones that were relevant for this particular aspect were the focus group discussions we held with rice farmers. So those would be the users of the technologies. We also spoke to a lot of members of the producer networks. And since they had such a key role to play in collecting and aggregating up information, we wanted to get an opportunity to understand what they were continuing to use and what they weren't. And then we also were speaking to some other key informants that could share their perspectives. So that meant governments and other kinds of businesses that were relevant to the model. Now, again, this was one of 4 different types of changes that we were looking at. So we looked at more than just this aspect of the program. The program really undertook a lot of different things. So what did we find? Well, it wasn't possible to speak to all of the networks, and hence we couldn't come up with a single number in terms of how many databases were still being managed by the local networks. What we did find was many of the local producer networks had reverted back to paper-based data collection, but certainly not all. Some of them are continuing to use Excel in particular to manage the information and collect it from their range of kind of producer organizations that belong to these producer unions. And we're going to get more into some of the lessons and implications that came out of that. The cloud-based software that Jean-Michel referred to, that one we didn't see being continued to use. So whereas the kind of tracking, Excel-based tracking for the purposes of understanding production levels, input needs, all these kind of things, we did see still being used. It wasn't the case when it came to those perhaps more sophisticated types of additional software. And one comment that came across from a number of the networks was that the more sophisticated tools tended to also have a price or a cost associated with them. That was not something that they were going to finance. So that's one thing as we initially spotted. But more important, and one of the reasons, in the overall design of this ex post, one thing that was so critical for us was we don't care ultimately, or we only partially care whether the specific things introduced by Naatal Mbay have endured so much as whether the ultimate aims of that particular intervention are continuing to be realized or not. That's what we call the focus functions. If somebody is still getting access to the information they need, whether or not they're using a specific cloud-based tool or not, might be irrelevant. Maybe they've moved on to the next greatest thing that wasn't around at the start when the program was. And ultimately, that's what we care about. So really a lot of our focus then was to understand, well, yeah, fine. Let's look for one thing at the tool itself, but how does it relate to the actual access to information? And as Jean-Michel had explained, data was a really critical element to the whole model that Naatal Mbay was working on, because that data was what was helping to inform the development of a much more effective aggregation system, so that when buyers were able to start working from and procure crop from different producers, they knew how much was there. They knew how much inputs were going to be needed to produce that rice. They had the data that they needed to effectively interact with the rice farmers. And so what we found was nearly all of the producer networks were continuing to collect that key information that they needed to inform those decisions in terms of explaining how much credit do they need, because a part of it we're not going to talk about in any detail today, but perhaps the biggest part of this study was really understanding the longevity of this integrated financing model, where essentially rice farmers were able to unlock the value of their rice collateral and use it for accessing inputs, things like that. So for producer networks, nearly all of them were continuing to collect the key information they needed relating to accessing credit, accessing inputs, and finding buyers for their product. And so ultimately, the fact that that was continuing enabled and was also reinforced by the continuation of this integrated financing model. Here's one quote by one of the producer networks, acknowledging that in their particular case, they're using a smartphone and computer that Naatal Mbay provided. They're adapting it. In their case, what was most important for them was understanding land area and production volumes on a yearly basis. Some of the other aspects, though, paying for data collectors and database managers, those are the aspects that have dropped by the wayside. Jean-Michel, anything you want to add before I go to the next slide?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is how they see it. What they're saying, we're not paying for the data collectors and data managers, which we used to cover, but it was in a certain form of organization. I mean, the function of collecting data happened, and the management of data also was carried on, but not in that kind of system. Mm-hmm. And also, one thing that happened was, because I called them recently and I said, so what's going on? And they're saying, well, the system is changing now because it's because, we'd always put the focus on finding ways on how to accelerate trade, not do what sometimes we do in value chain, try to maximize the holding gains of rice, but sell your rice as fast as you can and give the best rice possible, and the differential in speculative holding gains will disappear because it goes so fast. And so what you want is to have more rice and sell it as fast as possible. And then after that, you can negotiate the marginal gains. And so this acceleration is such at the present time. I asked him, this is a discussion I had like 3 weeks ago. I said, what's going on? And he said, well, the thing is going so fast because the prices are at such level now, given the Ukraine situation and all that, that the stage of accumulation at the farmer level has kind of disappeared. We're having like direct real-time connection uh, with the processors. The processors are investing in much larger storage space. And now the information flow really, the information flow works, but we don't have that intermediate stop of accumulation at the co-op and then picked up by the processor and transferred to their warehouse. The processors are asking the farmer organization to consolidate and drop at their own warehouse. And what's interesting here in terms of data is that, part of the system, it's not explained here, but the reason why the collateral works is because the processor warehouses are actually managed by a collateral manager that monitors independently all the movements of stock at a specific processor point. And of course has a database there and has some information. And that collateral manager is paid for by the processor, by the organization, and provide information to all the other actors on the stock movements that enable to manage the entire system. So the idea that they're not paying, and that's what you want to tell producers is that you are paying for it. You are paying it. It's actually included in the price. It's just that you're not the one paying for it, but the data is flowing and is circulating. And that's the kind of thing you want to be aware of when you develop systems, is to have a much broader area of how the data is circulating and how people have agency on the data points that they need and how that information is transferred. But what's interesting is that, there was a simplification of the system and an acceleration actually of the transaction flow and of the transparency and maintaining the financial performance. So actually you have a much more performing value chain. And so that's what that little nuance that you have here is that the testimonial we have here, the guy says, well, we're not using your system, we're sorry, but you're doing something else. And that's all right, and now our job, and I know that in the audience we have someone from the Follow-On Project. Well, the challenge of the Follow-On Project is to go see what's going on and understand it and see how they can facilitate the next step and what will be the next step in terms of market integration.
That's great. Then the other area that we looked at was some of the aspects. I think Jean-Michel has now jumped into this a little bit, which is great.
Yeah.
Which is really around. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to say that the one thing that I haven't talked about here is the one in the middle. The point in the middle is that, and that was, I think Josh will like that. We have Josh Woodard there, and we're talking about data governance. And what we found was that by getting farmer organizations to have this intimate knowledge of what data was, what an Excel spreadsheet was, what it could do, how you could massage it to get information and things like that. And same for the bank. Again, discussion a few weeks ago. I said, so what about cloud-based services? Maybe you didn't like that platform, but what the notion of a cloud service providers, and that's where he told me, he said, we don't want someone else to hold our data, and we are worried about their ability to provide a continuous service. So we prefer to have our own data. And I remember when the cloud service was there, farmer organizations would not leave their data in the cloud. They were systematically downloaded on their laptop. I'd ask them, the cloud is great. You could have interfaces and see it on your screen real time. I said, nah, nah. If it breaks down, we want our data on our laptops. And actually, even a buyer came in, and I remember, I was told in an interview once, I met some people there. They said someone came and offered us to be part of an app and to sell through an app, and we asked them, so can we get the data? And they said, no, you can't get it. I mean, it's on the app. I said, well, we're just not going to sell to you. We need our information. You're not going to hold our information. And they were right, because at one point the service provider decided not to go into agriculture, and I think that's what happened at one point. Service providers, at one point they said, okay, we're starting the season, we want to access our data, and there was some kind of glitch and they couldn't have their information, and that's just scared them. And so right now, I think they are really looking in that more defensive mode. And I think that's a domain where the follow-on program or other programs, can really assist those partners in going beyond that. Because, clearly, a lot of people use cloud services in the private sector, and they don't have problems with that. But it's just, there's a way of managing that. And maybe the way of managing that is not the way that development programs use, but more, those large system and real professional commercial systems, exploit cloud-based services. And so maybe we want to look into that. And of course, the price point, I mean, who pays? And in this case, like I said earlier, there is a system that collects the information. And, Ben saw it. The thing's going like to $70-80 million, 5-value chain. I told Ben, I said, if the data system was not working, this thing would have trashed miserably. But if it's growing and carrying on, it's because data is flowing. But the question is, where is it? And that's where just in a few phone calls, I said, there it is. And they are paying for it. It's just that we don't see it.
We gotta keep moving, because we got some very interesting implication slides, and I want to make sure we give everyone a little time to ask questions too. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to pass this on. We have I think 2-ish slides of some implications that we also want to just run through. So maybe I will talk about this one, and you can do the next one. I think some of the things that jumped out to us, for one, the infrastructure that Naatal Mbay and others, many others supported, of this organized system of farmer unions and association was a really helpful one to be able to support this data aggregation. And so that was an infrastructure that really supported both the collection and then the sharing of data, both in terms of the size of the network and its ability, therefore, to be attractive to other players in the value chain. Another one is being able, or an organization's capacity for ongoing oversight and connectivity is really important for its ability to keep using these types of systems. Obviously, with Naatal Mbay, it was focusing on some of the organizations that face some of the biggest constraints in this regard, just in terms of both of those factors. And that meant some of the things that you expect to see in terms of adoption, become really, really critical. The last point I think we covered already in terms of the ownership of data, and really how one of the things Jean-Michel said right at the start, the issue that this wasn't just one single app. I think one of the things that really became apparent from that was it meant that these organizations were really put in the driver's seat of their own learning. And that's a very interesting approach, because they ultimately, therefore, were not just data generators handing it off to somebody else, but actually responsible also to understand, process, and look at the information that they were generating, and then use it to go and procure the types of services that they needed. And that really, really enhanced, I think, learning capacity within these institutions. And Jean-Michel, why don't you wrap us up with this last slide?
Yeah. And so that's, there's a word that, in the early days of market system that actually Ben was pushing a lot, was this notion of churn. And churn is this thing that means that for a market to work, like some things work, some things die, some things are replaceable. And in development, we don't always understand that. We try to develop a thing so that it lasts as is forever. Yeah. And what I want to say is that, we really have to have a much more agile, intervention or facilitation approach where, we really take it as an ecosystem. And for an ecosystem, we'd have to kind of encourage churn between applications, between solutions, within the solution. And in our case, it's always to push the question and the co-creation further and gradually improve the system. And then, but everything needs to plug into outside infrastructure. And that's the other part, is that often, we'll do an application and people do something well, and then they'll say, I have to add that add-on, and then we'll do finance, and then we'll do tractors, and then we'll do that, and then we'll send rice recipes and whatever. So can you just focus on counting the farmers and making a good crop forecast? And for the rest, there will be other plugins and things like that, or developing an application that transfers information quickly to the insurance company. And that's it. And that is huge. But this notion of but don't go into the insurance company to tell them how to do their job, but develop something that plugs into their system. And also work with the insurance company so that the system picks up. But this is where you got to go. And again, simplification was a healthy evolution in this case, and it's inevitable. And but what I want to say is that, as much as I agree with the testimonial we read earlier, that the guy said, you know what, it's a bit too complicated. We counted our fields. We don't need to count them again. They don't change all the time. We don't have to recount them. And I say, yeah, you're right. But there is a thing called climate change where you're going to need to adapt and be much more precise than that. You're going to have to track new varieties and things like that. And he's not thinking about that. And I think that's one of the dimensions where new development programs can come up and say, listen, now you've got that tracking capacity. Well, there's something called climate change. Maybe you want to go a little bit deeper in terms of precision and maybe control the yields. Yeah, maybe do some precise assessment of the various fields you're working with. But how are we going to do that? Because that concerns everyone. So who's going to foot the bill for that? Who's going to develop that? It can only be a hybrid solution, but I think in this case, I think that little Senegal ecosystem is well placed to have that foundation on which to rest that precision farming infrastructure that can only be supported by digital technology. That's it.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, I hope that was helpful. We'd love to hear from you now. I imagine there may be some comments in the chat, perhaps. Otherwise, feel free to unmute, and we'd love to hear either reflections you have or something else this reminds you of, or things you'd like to clarify. I might stop my screen also so I can take a look at the chat. Let's see. Okay, there's a question for you, Jean-Michel, in terms of if the actual situation, the current situation, is more favorable for market system integration.
Yeah, well, it depends what we call the situation. I mean, the situation in terms of market pull, definitely there is a market pull. There is an interest for growth and for speed. Right now, in the rice sector in Senegal, the big challenge is to do full double cropping. And the minute the valley does full double cropping means that you end up with a potential of 300,000 additional tons of rice on the market. That's a lot of money. But right now, they haven't really cracked it, and done and that's really a question of timing. I think they're like almost there, and there's like a bunch of trade-offs and things, but the seed, they haven't been able to crack that one. And if they're able to do that, well, that will require more digital integration and speed and acceleration, integration of systems. But again, it's not a magical app that's going to do that. It's going to be, it's actually a much more accelerated trading mechanism. And that's why I was pretty happy with what I heard a few weeks ago is that, hey man, we just pared that down. The rice is going direct. The farmers, I'm hearing that some processors want to build silos in Senegal. Oh my God. So we're going away from the bags. We're going to, bulk handling. That's speed, okay? But it's also a complete cultural shift, man. I mean, okay. So that's what I'm saying, Abdullah. This is where it's going. And but we're going into Cargill territory here, and that's the valley, and little old valley with all those, 70 or so processors that are out there now. They're coming up with something interesting, but we really have to help them in that dimension to structure that system.
Yeah, that's great. And then Josh, is agreeing with the points about essentially the sustainability of any particular technology solution being fairly meaningless when what we really care about is if that access is ongoing or not, regardless of whichever platform you're using to achieve it.
I agree. I wanted to bring up another thing because I'm even like more ancient than that. I just wanted to know, does anyone remember Alta Vista?
I do.
And Netscape, man. I mean, some people were not born when Alta Vista died, you know. And so I just want to say, yet, Netscape just gave Andreessen, who's this big investor, and invested in the whole, he actually made a fortune on other people's ideas. Netscape was also, for those who don't know, one of those first search engines. And the creator of Netscape actually is still a huge venture capitalist in Second Silicon Valley. No, so yeah, that I agree what you're saying is, and what I'm saying, what I'm saying is, it is a system, and it's a commercial system, and that's not wrong. It's not. It's just that farmers have to face it, and it's a system that's driven by information and data more and more, and incredible levels of efficacy. And you don't want to give them a black box that will automate everything. You want to let them look under the hood You want them to make informed decisions, but you also want them to influence the design and even, participate in it. And my last point on that I always insist on is that I have found in the more remote places, young people with almost like a 10th grade training who became really good in data management and processing. So the idea of we have to think it all for them and prepackage it all for them is not really a good idea. I think the idea of co-creating and really like hacking together solutions uh, with them is a great thing. And my point is that if you don't do that, they're going to do it anyway. Okay, so try to add value. Don't try to replace and displace. It doesn't work. It won't work. You're going to be very disappointed when Ben goes and does an ex post assessment of the program.
That's great. I'll just put up on the screen. If you do want to follow up with either of us, here's our email addresses. And we've made these fancy QR codes. So if you want to check out the study in English or the brief of the study that's been done in both English and French, albeit with a spelling error, I'm noticing now. Please use the QR codes and take a look. And if you have any thoughts or reflections, we'd love to hear them. So
Okay.
thank you all.